Hey everyone, Brother Judd here. This week's Institute lesson all about the law of Moses. I know in weeks past I've gone through and I've kind of given you a month at a time to see where we're going, but there's so much in this lesson and I don't want it to get too long, so I'm just going to go ahead and skip all of that. But next week we're looking at Joshua and Judges, so keep that in mind. But before we go through the last of these three books of Moses, I want to take a brief pause and take a look at where we've been. The first book of Moses is Genesis. It's got 50 chapters. It makes up about 5% of the Old Testament. One sentence summary of the book of Genesis might be something like, Genesis explains how God's relationship with the world and Israel began. So, this is what the word Genesis means, the beginning. So it gives us explanations of that. The prominent characters in the book of Genesis, way too many to mention: Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, Abraham, Enoch, Noah, all his sons, Israel, the wives of everyone. Okay, it's lots of characters. The archetypes for which have just permeated throughout the history of Western culture. You will find a lot of the characters that we read about in history and fiction are to some extent patterned on these figures found in the book of Genesis. The ending scene of Genesis is Israel is just given blessings to his 12 sons and also 2 of his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And then there at the end of the book of Genesis, Israel, Jacob had his name changed to Israel. Israel dies there, living in the land of Egypt. And so then we move over to the second book of Moses, Exodus. It's made up of 40 chapters, roughly 4% of the Old Testament. One sentence summary might be that God saved Israel from slavery and enters into a covenant relationship with them. The prominent characters, of course, they're Moses and Pharaoh, and then also Moses' brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam. The prominent figures, maybe you could include Jethro in there, maybe just say all of Israel together, could be thrown into a group there. But those are the prominent characters, and then the ending scene is that Moses have gotten his people out of Egypt. They go there to the base of Sinai. They're commanded to build the tabernacle, which they do, and their efforts are honored by the Lord. And then we move over into the books that we haven't talked about yet: Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Leviticus makes up 27 chapters. It's 3% of the Old Testament. One sentence summary might be that God gives Israel specific instructions on how to worship Him. So this could be considered Leviticus is the type of worship handbook. This is how you're going to run the church, so to say. It's the handbook of instruction for religious practice and ceremony and worship and festivals and sacrifices and the tabernacle and all of that, okay? It's given the book of, it's called the book of Leviticus because it's predominantly concerned with the Levites, the priests who will officiate in a lot of these things. So the prominent characters are Moses, Aaron and his sons. That's where we get the term Aaronic priesthood from. And then other than the priests, the Levites, we also have the people, and they are instructed on a number of things regarding how to properly worship God. The ending scene of this is not really an ending scene, but God gives the instructions regarding tithes and offerings. And that's how the book of Leviticus ends. A funny story about the book of Leviticus: there's a German saying, when you are really mad at someone, you tell them that you are going to read Leviticus to them. And that lets the person know, oh no, I'm in big trouble. One, either because the book of Leviticus is so boring and I'm in for it, or the book of Leviticus contains just the law. And so you know that justice is soon coming because someone's reading Leviticus to you. The book of Numbers, it's called the book of Numbers possibly because there is a census taken at the beginning and the end of the book of Numbers. The people are numbered at the bookends of this book. It's comprised of 36 chapters, 4% of the Old Testament. One sentence summary might be Israel fails to keep their covenant and wanders in the wilderness for 40 years. So if Exodus is part 1, Leviticus is the handbook, then Numbers would be part 2. It's a lot of the rest of the story of what happens while Israel is traipsing across the wilderness. Prominent characters here again, Moses, Aaron, Miriam were also introduced to Joshua. There's another figure, Balaam. He's the one who has a talking donkey. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the talking donkey, but if you want to ask in the discussions on Tuesday night or Wednesday at noon, feel free. We can talk all about Balaam and his precocious quadruped. The ending scene here is Israel's enemies are conquered, and then instructions are given for how the promised land is to be divided up amongst the various tribes. And so that's how the book of Numbers ends. The last book of the fifth book, the last book, the fifth book here, Deuteronomy, it gets its name. So Deutero, it's a Greek term. So given when the Bible was translated over into Greek, it was named the Book of Deuteronomy. It means the second law, and so for 34 chapters, roughly 4% of the Old Testament. The one sentence summary may be that Moses rehearses everything that happened to Israel in the wilderness for 40 years, and so it is a second telling of the law, or a second telling, a rehearsal of the things that they have gone through. So Deutero, second, Nomi, law. It's the second law. It's not that there's a new law, it's just the second telling of it and how Israel has either applied or misapplied it over the last 40 years. Again, we've got Moses, Israel as a whole, Joshua, very prominent figures, and then all of the ites, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Moabites, all of these different ites that Israel is commanded to fight against and to conquer. They also are noteworthy here in the book of Deuteronomy. The ending scene is they come right up to the promised land. They've conquered the enemies that are halting their path to entering the promised land, but Moses, he sees it, but he is not allowed to enter into the promised land for something that happened in Numbers chapter 20. So you can go check out Numbers chapter 20, read all about that story. If you have more questions. Again, Tuesday nights, Wednesdays. If you can't make those, then shoot me an email. But I'm very curious to hear your take on why Moses can't enter the promised land. So that's it for kind of the overview of the books that we'll be looking at today. Now, I'm not going to dive in with my iPad and go through a whole lot of verses and mark things. Hope for a lot of these things, the chapter headings will suffice, where you'll be able to get the overview of what's going on. But I do want to talk about how across these 5 books of Moses, these make up what is referred to as the law. Now, this is different from the law of Moses, kinda, okay? Now, the law of Moses came to be interpreted as a number of 613 commandments. Now, when you go through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you can pick out where the Lord, through Moses, says 613, not thou shalt, but these are the ways that Israel ought to organize and ought to worship and ought to sacrifice, things that you should do, things that you shouldn't do, things that you should eat, things that you should not eat. And so it was much later. It's not in the Bible where these things are codified as not the 10 commandments, but the 613 commandments. That happens much later. There was some disagreement amongst Jewish rabbis and philosophers about which commandments make it in, which commandments should be excluded, which ones are important, which ones don't worry about so much. And, the saying goes that if you want 10 different opinions about the law of Moses, then just find 10 different rabbis and ask them what their opinion is, and you're going to get all types of interpretations, okay? A lot like what happens with us when we go to Sunday school and, there's some particular point of doctrine or principle or practice that is talked about, and you get a lot of different people saying, well, this is what I think. So after Moses is gone, there, was an effort. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's next week when we get to Joshua, and we can talk about what happens when you move from a very significant prophetic type figure to the people who follow him. Similar to Joseph and Brigham. We have a dispensation head here with Moses, and when Joshua comes after. But again, getting ahead of myself, that's all for next week, so we'll take care of that. I think sometimes the law of Moses gets caricatured as, it's not the real eternal law. That's not what God intended for them to receive. Because they worshiped the golden calf, they got a lesser law. Now, while that is true, there's still a lot of really great things in the law of Moses, okay? It's not just this collection of, the Book of Mormon calls it, carnal commandments, observances and things they were supposed to do to keep them continually reminded of who the Lord is and the covenants they've made. While there definitely is a lot of that in the law of Moses, there are also some very beautiful things about how to treat strangers, how to take care of the poor. There's that famous line about, the law of Moses is just all about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, it's a little bit more than that. Let's say that an ancient Israelite were to have rendered someone blind. It's not just that you have to go, stab yourself in the eye. What good would that do to the camp of Israel? No. You then are duty bound to be that person's eyes for the person that you rendered blind. So it's not just, I took somebody's eye here, I'm going to give them my eye now. No, it doesn't work that way. You need to offer restitution in a way where if you have rendered someone or rendered damage to someone, then you need to give your life in the service of making that better, of bringing things back around. And so try not to caricature the law of Moses as best you can as you read the chapter headings or as we discuss the law of Moses. Because yes, while it definitely was a lesser law, there's still so much that is good in there. Now, are there things that are totally wonky? Yes, we will talk about some of those laws that really offend our modern sensibilities. But there are also a lot of things in there, especially I'm thinking of, is it Deuteronomy 19? That sounds very, very Christian, sounds very love your neighbor. Doesn't quite say, pray for them who despitefully use you. But there's a lot of very eternal, good-hearted Christian doctrine contained in the law of Moses. So don't write the whole thing off. As mentioned before, these 613 commandments, they touch on a number of different topics. You can see here behind me, just kind of some highlights. Of course, it talks about how to worship God, talks about proper prayer, talks about marriage, divorce, and family. What a lot of people talk about today are, the forbidden sexual relations, and it mentions homosexuality in there, but it spends a whole lot more time talking about avoiding incest and not abusing one's family. So we can't just kind of scripture snipe these law of Moses items, things that we pull out of the Book of Deuteronomy and use them to hit people over the head with. No, I'm sure that were all of us to go through the law of Moses, all 613 commandments, we would all find elements of the law of Moses that we are not doing well. Now, of course, yes, Jesus came and he fulfilled the law. Paul talked about how, it's the letter that killeth, but the spirit maketh alive. And you will see this difficulty that early Christians who came from a law of Moses background had a very difficult time with. Well, what do we hold on to and what do we let go of? Well, that's the necessity of prophets to help us interpret these things. So I hope that's not something that any of us would be guilty of, is pulling particular scriptures, passages out of Scripture to go hit somebody over the head with. That's just it's not cool. And as mentioned over there in Deuteronomy chapter, was it 17 or 19? I think it's 19. I'll have to look it up for sure. But I'll make sure that we talk about those in our Tuesday night and Wednesday discussions, because there's a lot of Christ here in the Old Testament. It was meant to point people towards Him, and so of course we're going to find a lot of who Christ is and those eternal laws in the law of Moses. But a lot of these things, elements of the law of Moses we don't observe anymore. Like, for example, the commandment to observe different times of the year and to do different things in those observations. So you'll see here the calendar of Jewish festivals. You can see that the calendar that we're used to, January through December, you see it up there, surrounded by the Jewish months. You'll see the different observed festivals and whatnot. So if you look over there, March, April, the month of Abib, you'll see Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's around our Easter time. You'll see if you go over to Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, over there in October. That's the time when traditionally it's seen as not just the New Year, but it's celebrated as the time when Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden. And so all types of traditions that are, the Lord says, I want you to observe these things. I want your lives to have cycles to them and patterns of observation where you focus on different things at the different times in your lives. And so there in the Book of Deuteronomy, it spells out, worship these things at these times and these things at other times. And of course, subsequent rabbis and whatnot, they have added to the different festivals and whatnot. And we still have, a lot of influence in Western culture stems from these the celebration of these Jewish festivals. One thing that always comes up when talking about the law of Moses is the sacrifices, animal sacrifices for different things. Now, I spent some time contemplating if I was going to go over in this video the different types of sacrifices, the heave offering and the sin offering, and just all the different types of offerings of sacrifices that were available. I think though I'm going to outsource that to the Bible dictionary. If you look up whether with a paper copy or the digital version, sacrifices, the Bible dictionary, it'll tell you more than you ever wanted to know about the different sacrifices. But if we lived in the Church of Jesus Christ of let's say Enoch Day saints, animal sacrifice was the commandment of the day. Sacrifices would have been offered just like Adam and Eve offered sacrifice. There was the symbolism there pointing toward the great and last sacrifice that is Jesus Christ. And these things were important. I wonder if, to what extent, if there was still more outward expression of inward commitments, that took place in and around the sacrament. The sacrament, the Lord's Supper replaces animal sacrifice. If there were some more things there, if it would be easier for us to understand. I'm not sure. That's something that I would love to talk with you about. But go check out the Bible dictionary entry on sacrifices, and I think that'll give you a pretty good idea of what's going on there. So a question comes, what advantages are there to 613 commandments? What advantages are there to a calendar that is so spelled out about celebrate these things at these times? There's a calendar set up for making sure that a congregation reads through the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, that those are read every single year, that it's done as a congregation. And so people continually hear this over and over and over, that there are celebrations set up around when a young man or a young woman can participate in the reading of the Torah scroll there in any given congregation. Now, I shouldn't say any given congregation because some very conservative congregations only allow men. The more liberal ones allow girls to participate, girls and women to participate. But you get what I mean there. When my family and I lived in Skokie, Illinois, we had a lot of Jewish neighbors. Some who were very observant and would not talk with us because we were not of the tribe. However, our landlord, he was Jewish and a delightful fellow. He was very, very good to us, for which I will be eternally grateful. We had other Jewish neighbors who really didn't do more with their Jewish heritage than, celebrate some of the festivals and eat some of the unique food here and there. But that was about it. So, just like in Christianity or anything else, you have a spectrum to levels of observance. But the question to you would be, what advantages do you find to such a well spelled out, this is what you're supposed to do, these are the things you're not supposed to do? And then the following question would be, what disadvantages are there? What dangers could there be in having things so well spelled out that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of room for interpretation? Although, when I mentioned before that little saying about the rabbis and getting 10 different rabbis giving 10 different interpretations, but, just what are your feelings about when you feel like things are a little more tightly controlled versus when things are a little more loose and open to interpretation? Do you have a preference? Advantages, disadvantages to both? What do you think? What do you think? Last thing I want to talk about here with regard to the law of Moses is the tabernacle. And I hope that my my little diagram is showing up here, because what I have here is a illustration of the tabernacle. And so you'll see the tabernacle, it's configured in a certain way. Now this is all outlined there in the law, in the books of Moses that we were talking about. So I'm not going to go through and read this verse, and this is where it mentions the altar, and this verse mentions the bronze basin. And no, just trust me, it's all in there. If you want the references, I can fetch them for you. But what we have here is, let's say that here we are standing at the door of the tabernacle, and you would have to come here and you would present yourself to the priest. And the tribes of Israel were broken up into tribes, and then different, minor, or not minor, but lesser divisions of the people. And those people would report themselves to a specific priest. So the church today, where we have bishops, I've heard it said before that how the church is presently configured with families and wards and congregations and stakes and areas, that configuration looks more like the Old Testament church than possibly it looks like the New Testament church. The Old Testament church was much, much, much better organized than the New Testament church seemed to be. And of course, that would have been just because of geography and lack of communication and small congregations being here, there, and everywhere. But anyway, they were all in one place, traveling around the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years, so they were well organized. But here we are, we come to the door of the tabernacle, we present ourselves. Now, part of the law of Moses is you have to be ritually clean before you can enter out here, the world, and then go into this holy place, okay? So the court of the temple is made up of what is outside here, okay? So this is all outside. You go, you bring your offering, you take it to the priest. The priest declares, that you are ritually worthy to be there. The things that would disqualify a person for going to the outer court of the temple would have been coming in contact with something that was dead, coming in contact with something that's unclean, breaking particular cleanliness rules of the law of Moses. A lot of those had to do with fluids being expelled from the body. And so not just like if somebody gets cut or something like that, but we're talking more about things regarding women and menstruation, or men and we'll just say, I hope you know what I'm saying. So that would render someone a man ritually unclean, okay? And some of those don't make a whole lot of sense. So for example, I was talking about this with my wife years ago, where we were going through some of these law of Moses laws about, ritual cleanliness. She's like, well, that's not very fair that, a woman is just going through, her cycle, and she gets, like she has to separate herself from the rest of the camp, and she can't participate in ritual worship and whatnot. And then she's actually, well, actually, if I had a time where I could just go be with with other women every month, and nobody could place any demands on me, I actually think I'd be okay with that. So I'll let the women cast judgment on that one. I'll just describe it for how it is, but there were things that we look at today thinking, that seems a little heavy-handed. But again, let's try not to cast our judgments of things, our 21st century understanding of things here on the ancient world. So you'd come, you'd give your sacrifice. Different people would give different types of animals depending on the type of sacrifice they were offering, and also their economic status. If they had resources, they tended to flaunt that, and if they didn't, they would give a smaller offering. But the sacrifice would be offered here. You have this basin here for washing, and when the priests would come, they would officiate here, and kind of this would be as far as the regular person of the camp of Israel would make it. The priests, they took care of the rest of this. So a priest coming to the door of the tabernacle, talks about in Exodus how Aaron and his sons were brought to the door of the tabernacle and they were washed and anointed, so preparatory to them coming into the holy place. And so this is the actual building, okay? Well, I guess it's not a building yet. It's still a moving, transportable tabernacle. But eventually, when the when Solomon's temple is built, then it is a building. But the priests, they come in here, and here in the holy place, okay, making up kind of this next third of the temple, there are a number of things in here. There's the table of presence. This would be where the table of showbread is significant of reminding Israel of the manna. You have the lampstand right here, indicative of offering prayers. Also, the altar of incense, where incense would be burned. Another, symbol of prayers ascending to heaven. But then you had the veil of the temple that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And here, the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. It was there, they were commanded to build the ark. It had 2 angels with their wings outstretched, and it would form what was referred to as the mercy seat. And this is where the Lord would come and his presence would be. And you didn't have priests going into the Holy of Holies every day. It was only on particular days when that would happen, or when the Lord would say, "Hey, I need to let you know something." Then you would have someone go there to the Holy of Holies. And so you have this stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 method of going through and learning things. Now, maybe you're asking yourself, well, why couldn't they just be taught everything here? What's the deal with like symbols and Christian liturgies and going through kind of all this song and dance of doing this? What's to all of that? I get that. In fact, I remember after I'd gone to the temple for my own endowment and having gone through the first time, then I went on a mission and I came home and I started going regularly. And I got a little tired of this temple does not make a whole lot of sense, because I was trying to apply my 21st century post-Enlightenment version of education on the temple rather than letting the temple impose itself on me. And so, I would just try to brain my way through everything. You'll see a lot of similarities. Latter-day Saints today, this is going to get messy, I apologize, but we come to the door of the temple where we present ourselves, and a temple recommend declares whether we are worthy or not to enter into the next stage of the temple. You go there, this telestial type of sphere, where you're taught specific things preparatory to coming and learning more things in a terrestrial type of sphere, moving in the temples from the telestial room to the terrestrial room, eventually going through the temple veil and entering into the celestial room, where symbolically the presence of God is there. And so you see this same 3-type educational setting where it's more than just thinking about things. It's costuming, and it's receiving instruction, and it's playing parts. And there in the endowment ceremony, were there similarities between the Old Testament tabernacle and the endowment ceremony? Some, especially the 3-part nature to progression and symbolically walking back into the presence of God. But, a lot of differences as well. We can't overlook those things. We can't think that what they did there in the tabernacle is exactly the way that things are done in Latter-day Saint temples today. Even in my lifetime, the endowment ceremony has gone through some changes. So regardless, I share all of that because both the tabernacle and the temple, it's an ancient way of learning. I know here with COVID-19 restrictions in place, we can't participate in temple ordinances as much as we'd like to. But spend some of perhaps the quiet time that you find yourselves with, because we still can't go out and do a whole lot. Think about, what do you remember from your temple experiences? Whether you've only participated in baptisms for the dead, or you have done endowment and sealing sessions. Perhaps you even have yet to participate in any of them. Are there particular things that are better learned when you go to particular places? I believe that. I think that the Lord's ancient pattern for learning has a lot more to do with just crunching through it in our heads. I think there is something to holy places and holy rituals and holy rites and services and those types of things. So that may be one of the strengths of the law of Moses, that it helped educate the people more than just a cognitive brain way, but it taught their whole selves, and not just the intellect. So I hope that was worth your time, but I look forward to talking about the law of Moses and ritual and how you feel about that, because we have a real kind of generational discomfort with such things these days. And I wonder if there is something to learn from the ancient world in law of Moses types of practices. I'll bear my testimony that once trying to do better about letting the temple go through me, and not trying to make the temple fit my language, but trying to better understand the language of symbolism, it's made all the difference in the world. It's nice to just go, and I look forward to going back again when I can just spend time in the temple and say, Lord, I'm not going to treat this like a self-help session. No, what do you want me to pick up from all of this? And as you just kind of, I don't know, it's probably, well, it's symbolic. We're talking all about symbols. You just kind of marinate there in what the temple has to offer. They've often made sense in my heart before they clicked in my head. Won't always work that way, but my experience is it's when those two meet, the mind and the heart, when your mind understands things that your heart knows, and then when your heart finally catches up and can understand things that you cognitively you cognitively can comprehend, but when your heart gets behind it, it's when you bring the mind and the heart together that real revelation takes off. Now that should sound like a reference out of the Doctrine and Covenants. See if you can find it. But God does have a lot to teach us, whether it's in temples and tabernacles or elsewhere. I hope that we'll keep ourselves open to His Word, to His whisperings, to His Spirit, and I share that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.